For our presentation, we chose to cover Nannie Doss, otherwise known as the Lonely Hearts Killer, the Giggling Granny, or the Granny Killer. And this presentation was done by Hazel Smith, Anna Fry, and Ava Thien. So, going into Nannie Doss's background, she was born on November 4th, 1905, in Anniston, Alabama, as Nancy Hazel, to her parents Jim and Louisa, and she grew up with 3 sisters and 1 brother. And she was raised by parents who were quite opposite from each other. Her father was strict, abusive, he was an alcoholic, and he would often make the children stay home from school to work on the farm. And because of this, Nannie only ended up receiving a 6th-grade education. And on the other hand, her mother was actually a good mother. She was very loving, and one of her hobbies was reading romance magazines or romance novels, and after her mom was done reading them, Nannie would pick them up and read them herself. And so, in 1912, when Doss was 7 years old, the first significant event in her life happened. She was riding on a train to visit extended family with her family, and when the train had to make an emergency stop, and when it did, she was thrown forward out of her seat, and she hit her forehead on the metal bar of the seat in front of her. And after this head injury, throughout her childhood, she went through bouts of depression and blackouts, and she would go on to claim that this head injury is what caused her to do the things that she did in her adulthood, which we'll talk about. And then moving on to when Doss is 16, she's working at a linen factory when she meets a coworker named Charles Bragg. She dates him for 3 or 4 months, and then with her father's approval, they marry in 1921, and then between the years of 1923 and 1927, they have 4 daughters together. And 2 of these daughters would actually end up being her first victims. Her middle daughters, Zelmer and Gertrude, both died in 1927. Zelmer died on August 30th, and Gertrude died on September 25th, less than a month later. So, reports say that both were healthy in the morning, they were fine when their father left for work, but by lunchtime they had fallen ill, and then shortly after passed away. And at the time, it was suspected that they had gotten some kind of food poisoning that had killed them, but now it's strongly believed that Nannie poisoned them for reasons we don't know. But after this, Charlie Bragg actually became very scared of Nannie. He has reported that he wouldn't eat or drink anything she made him when she was mad, and his fear was so great that he ended up leaving her shortly after Gertrude passed away. He took the eldest daughter, Melvina, with him, but left the youngest, Florine, with Nannie. And then about a year later, he returned with another woman, and gave Melvina back to Nannie. And so Nannie now had Melvina and Florine, and in 1928, she ended up getting divorced from Charles Bragg. And then this is just a newspaper clipping from after the funeral of Gertrude, who was 2 years old at the time of her death. It reads, Bragg funeral at King Creek Church lot on Wednesday. The body of Gertrude, 2-year-old daughter of Mr. and Mrs. Charles Bragg, was buried Wednesday afternoon at the Cane Creek Cemetery. The services being conducted at the home of Reverend W. S. Griffin. This little girl died Tuesday night at the home at Blue Mountain after a brief illness, many friends accompanying the funeral party to the burial place. And then moving on to her 3rd victim, which was her granddaughter, the daughter of her oldest child, Melvina. Melvina gave birth to a baby girl in February of 1945, but the baby did not end up surviving long after birth. It was pronounced dead, and doctors had no idea why it had died. But Melvina later reported that after she had given birth, when her mother was holding the baby, she thought she saw Nannie stick a hat pin into the baby's head, but she was exhausted. She had just given birth. She was on drugs. She was on drugs from the doctors, and so she didn't quite trust her memory until a few days later. She confided in her husband and her sister Florine about what she had seen, and they confirmed that they had both seen Nannie holding a pin around the time when the baby was pronounced dead. But if anyone had any suspicions about Nannie or wanted to take anything further, as far as we know, nothing was reported to the police. And to this day, Nannie was not charged with the death of her granddaughter, although it's strongly believed that she did kill her granddaughter. And then moving on to Robert Lee Higgins, who was Melvina's first child. She had Robert Lee Higgins in 1943, the baby girl in 1945. So a few months after the baby girl's death, she had a fight with her husband. She went to her father's house and ended up leaving her son Robert with Nannie. And it was while in Nannie's care that Robert ended up dying of asphyxia from unknown causes. At the time, the death was thought to be accidental, even though Nannie Doss had made a life insurance policy on her grandson, $500, which is equivalent to $8,500 today, which she collected after his death. Again, if anyone suspected anything, if Melvina suspected anything, nothing was ever reported to the police as far as we know. And then this is another newspaper clipping from after the funeral of Robert Lee Higgins. It reads, "Funeral services for Robert Lee Higgins II, son of Mr. and Mrs. Leno Higgins, who died Saturday in Jacksonville, were held here yesterday at 2 o'clock at the Congregational Holiness Church in Jacksonville. Reverend Hughes Garman officiated. Burial was at Jacksonville Cemetery, Johnston in charge." And then later on, his death was ruled a homicide, and his grandmother later confessed to her involvement. And now moving on to Nannie Doss's second husband. So she got divorced from Charles Bragg in 1928. Robert Franklin Harrelson was her second husband. In 1929, Nannie was looking through the Lonely Hearts column when she saw Robert's ad, and they wrote back and forth for a short time and ended up getting married shortly after they met in 1929. This marriage would be Nannie Doss's longest one, lasting 16 years from 1929 to 1945. But sadly, shortly after they got married, Nannie discovered that he was an alcoholic. He had a felony assault charge, so it was not the perfect romance that she had anticipated for herself. And one day, Robert was out partying with friends. He came home drunk, and he ended up sexually assaulting Nannie. The next day, Nannie found a hidden corn whiskey jar that he had, and she decided to fill it with rat poison, which he then drank the next evening, and he died a very slow, painful death. He died on September 7th, 1945. And moving on to the year 1950, 5 years later, so Dovey Weaver is our next victim, and she was actually Nannie Doss's sister. Not much is known about this murder. As you can see in the picture off to the right, it shows Doss being interviewed by Captain Harry Stagg, and it reads that although she was quite happy admitting to the arsenic murders, the murders of her husbands, she became quite closed off and solemn when questioned about the deaths of her family members. For this reason, we don't know a lot about the death of Dovey. What we do know is that sometime in June 1950, Doss went to stay with her sister, likely because Dovey was bedridden because she had cancer at the time. But shortly after Nannie Doss arrived at the house, Dovey ended up passing away in her sleep on June 30th. And it is thought now that Doss might have smothered Dovey in her sleep, but this is all we know about this murder, sadly.
Victim number 8, Sarah Lanning, 1950. Sarah Lanning was Arlie Lanning's mother, Doss's mother-in-law. Sarah Lanning lived with the couple and continuously critiqued and belittled Doss. Doss is thought to have grown tired of this treatment and poisoned her. Sarah died on September 7th, 1950. During this time, before the autopsies were called for it, was thought that Sarah passed away from cardiorenal syndrome, which essentially is where the heart just stops. Right here, you can see the death certificate of Sarah Elizabeth Leonard Lanning. Date of death 9/7/50. Victim number 9, Arlie Lannings, 1952. Nannie married Arlie 3 days after she met him in Lexington, North Carolina, while she was traveling, making this her third marriage and through a Lonely Hearts column. He was known as a womanizer and an alcoholic, but Nannie was disappearing for months at a time. Nannie claimed Arlie Lining died from heart failure, and after the funeral, their house had been burned down. The house was meant for Lanning's sister, but due to the fire, insurance money went to Nannie Doss. The death certificate was marked with cardiac failure with coronary occlusion. As you can see on this death certificate, the date of 2/16/52 of Arlie Lining. Victim number 10, Louisa Hazel, 1950. After the death of her husband, Nannie Doss's mother, Louisa, was in poor health and came to stay with Nannie and her new husband, Richard Morton. Louisa died days after arriving at the home in January 1953 after complaining of severe stomach pain. Victim number 11, Richard L. Morton, 1953. Nannie Doss got a Diamond Circle Club membership in order to find a new husband and had met Richard. After Nannie Doss had poisoned Louisa, Richard L. Morton would pass away just 3 months later. The final victim being Samuel Doss, 1954. Nannie Doss met Samuel Doss in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they married in June 1953. Samuel went to the hospital because he was having flu-like symptoms, but was released on October 5th after being diagnosed and treated for a severe digestive tract infection. Nannie killed Samuel that night as she wanted the 2 life policies. An autopsy was done that showed arsenic in his system, and Nannie was arrested. Evidence found: Nannie gave permission for medical examiners to perform an autopsy on his body. This led to the initial discovery of the weapon of choice, a lethal dose of arsenic. There was arsenic found in the victim's body after they were exhumed and autopsied of the 4 husbands and her mother. Confession: Nannie confessed to the killings 4 of her husbands, her mother, her sister Dovie, her grandson Robert, and her mother-in-law Arnie Lanning's mother. She confessed to the murders on the condition that the investigators let her keep a romance magazine that she had during an interview.
Court proceedings. Nannie Doss was arrested in 1954. Judge Elmer Adams decided to hold her in jail without bond after her first appearance in court. When Doss was arrested after killing Samuel, though, she was sent to stay 90 days in a state mental hospital for observation. She tried to plead insanity, but she was deemed competent to stand trial. She was indicted for charges of murder against her 5th husband, Samuel Doss. Prosecutors decided not to pursue charges for the other victims because they thought they had enough evidence to put her behind bars for life. They had the autopsy results of Samuel Doss, as well as a confession from Nannie herself. Now, this confession, though, took them about 6 hours plus, and were 4 different teams of interrogators that all had to swap out between each other.
At her arraignment on May 17, 1955, Nannie pleaded guilty, avoiding the trial that's set to begin on June 2nd. She was sentenced to life in prison on June 2nd, being spared the electric chair due to her sex. Here are some of the newspaper articles about the Granny Nanny, who was accused of poisoning. You can see the unearthed body shows traces of arsenic. Cops probe deaths of free healed by grandmother. The agent says they will seek to have Harrison's body and the body of Richard Lee Higgins, Miss Dawes' 2.5-year-old grandson, exhumed. Just some of the details of what was going on in the news. Nannie Dawes' death. After spending 10 years in prison, Nannie Dawes passed away in the Oklahoma State Penitentiary on June 2, 1965, from leukemia. She passed away at the age of 59 years old. Dawes still resides today at Oak Hill Memorial Park, McAllister, Pittsburgh County, Oklahoma, USA, in Plot Section 24A. This information can be found on findagrave.com. This is another newspaper clipping of Nannie's passing, where it claims that Nannie Dawes' conscience is now clear. Though, while I find it interesting, I find it hard to believe that a serial killer would have their conscience clear after passing, whereas they didn't have any conscience while killing. But that's just one take on it. There is unaccounted for information that's interesting, where Nannie Dawes had a period in her life where she disappeared during her third marriage, specifically to Arlie Lanning, and she would be gone for months at a time. There was a period unaccounted for where it's believed she lived in New York and Idaho, and was possibly married to a man named Hendricks. But we're not sure if he fell prey to her temperament or not. It's also unrecorded and only found in one source. Now there's also questions that remain was it the head injury as a small child due to the time and era that possibly lacked for medical attention that could have caused her to be a serial killer? We honestly won't know because there's not enough research done on her. And then Frank Harrelson had a 2-year-old grandson who died 3 months before he did. But Dawes was never connected with the grandson's death or admitted to it. Possible contributions to her psychosis. Now, as a serial killer, she suffered from a head injury as a child, one that would have damaged her frontal lobe. She also witnessed an unhealthy, abusive relationship between her parents. Had no formal education past the 6th grade. She was allegedly sexually assaulted as a child by men in town, and her father did not believe her when she went to him. He even had Dawes join her first marriage by introducing each other, but her first marriage was to an alcoholic. And she had an obsessive and unrealistic expectation of true love. This comes from her obsession as a child with romance magazines. A couple movies she talked about, specifically TV, but mainly her magazines. Now, this is a map that shows all the locations that Nannie Dawes killed in. This is just going to be a quick recap of how quickly she killed her victims and where she moved around to. So the green point is where Nannie Dawes first killed in 1927. She first killed her daughters Zelmer, who was less than 1, and Gertrude, age 1, in Jacksonville, Calhoun County, Alabama. That was about 17 minutes away from Anniston, where Dawes grew up. Then in 1945, Dawes would be suspected to have killed her daughters, Melvina's newborn baby girl. This is even cited on the funeral page of the baby girl, who's only referred to as baby girl Higgins. In July 1945, a few months after the granddaughter's death, Nannie killed grandson Robert, age 2. Then, still in Jacksonville, Calhoun County, Alabama, In September, a few months again, Nannie killed Robert Harlison, her second husband. Now in Gadsden, Etowah County, Alabama, Doss went to Sister Debbie and killed her in June. Now moving out of state to Lexington, Davidson County, North Carolina, the purple marker, Doss gets with her third husband, Arlie, but kills his mother Sarah before him in 1950 September. Then Arlie was killed in Lexington, Davidson County, North Carolina, as well as in 1952. In Lexington, she killed her mother in 1953, a few months before she killed Richard Morton, husband number 4. Now at the yellow marker, she would kill Richard 4 months after her mother in Emporia, Lyon County, Kansas. Now the final marker, the red one, Doss would kill her last victim, husband number 5, Samuel Doss, in Sand Spring, Tulsa County, Oklahoma. This would lead to her eventual arrest. But this pattern is important because this shows she was a spree serial killer. She never took long breaks or pauses between her kills and killed in multiple states. She is a notorious female serial killer, and she is not studied enough in many of our opinions.
Nannie Doss, how many girls are in the women's side of the Oklahoma State Penitentiary?
There's 31 on my side and 26 on the colored side.
Do all the girls call you Nannie?
No, so part of them calls me Mama.
Mom?
Yes, sir.
May I call you Nannie in the
That's right.
Where were you born, Nannie?
I was born in Alabama, Anderson.
Did you have a large family?
I had 4 sisters and a brother.
Were you rich?
No, sir. Farmer.
Did you work in the field?
Yes, sir.
How long?
All my life.
How old were you when you first got married?
16,
And how many times were you married?
5.
Why are you in the penitentiary now?
Oh, the claims I killed my husband.
Which, your last husband?
Yes, sir.
Did they say you killed any more?
Yes,
Or
sir.
your other husbands? Which other?
3 of them.
Did you?
No, sir.
How did they say you claimed they say you killed her?
They claimed I poisoned them.
But you say you didn't poison them?
I didn't.
At the time you were convicted, was there a lot of talk in the newspapers about that conviction?
Yes, sir.
What did they say about it?
Oh, they just said all kinds of nasty things.
Do you think they were right?
No, sir.
Do you still maintain that you did not poison either your last husband or any of the
I
others?
certainly do.
Nannie, what would you like to have more than anything else in the world?
Well, my freedom first. And the next, I like a small TV for my room.
You like to watch television?
Yes, sir.
What do you like to see?
Well, I like to see a good story. I like singing, good singing.
You mean preaching?
Yes, sir.
Do you listen to preaching sermons within the prison wall?
Yes, sir.
About music?
I listen to all kind of music.
What
I
kind do you
enjoy
like?
music. Well, I really like hillbilly music.
How about this rock and roll Elvis Presley music you like?
Well, I don't care very much about it myself.
How about the younger girls over there today?
They enjoy it very much.
Getting back to the reason you were convicted, who do you blame for that?
Myself.
Why?
Well, I didn't know anything about it, and never the attorney told me to go down and plead guilty. I just did.
Do you think it's valuable for people to have some knowledge of the law
I certainly do.
in cases like this?
I certainly do.
How long would you be in prison?
Well, I spent it for life.
Would you ever get out?
I hope.
What would you do if you get out?
I would take my daughter's children and put them all four together and try to raise them.
What sort of a living would you try to make? What would you do?
Well, I don't know anything except in housekeeping and farm work.
What do you do over in the women's side of the prison?
I work in laundry,
Iron?
ironing, washing.
Does that pay you any money?
No, sir. Except in when I wash for the girls.
If you could say something to people on the outside, say a mother who has a teenage daughter, what would you tell her about raising that daughter?
I tell her to tell the church and keep her close by.
You think love is important today?
Yeah,
Thank you very much, Nannie Doss.
too.